Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. The situation in occupied Kashmir is worsening with every single passing day as the curfew and the complete communication blackout has entered its 45th day. Over 8 million innocent Kashmiris are under brutal Indian subjugation. The EU Parliament has termed presence of 1 million Indian army personnel there as dreadful. The MPs have demanded the immediate lifting of lockdown, restoration of normalcy, fundamental rights, communication blackout, freedom of movement, and release of political prisoners in the Indian-occupied Kashmir. But despite international censure, India's posturing has remained continuously belligerent, as External Affairs Minister S. J. Shankar has said that India hoped to gain physical control of Azad Jammu and Kashmir one day. And Pakistan has, on the other hand, rejected and slammed, terming the statement inflammatory and irresponsible. To talk more about the worsening situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir and international censure to India, we are joined by Ms. Tehmina Janjua, Minister Special Representative on Diplomatic Outreach, and has also served as a Foreign Secretary. And we have also been joined by Dr. Ather Zia, a writer and anthropologist from Colorado. And we have also been joined by Mr. Qurban Hussain, the member of House of Lords from London. All of you, thank you very much for joining into the show. I'd like to start to take the discussion right from the start to Ms. Tehmina Janjua, to you. How do you see this statement by the European Union Parliament, with the MPs have raised concern how this statement has been received by Pakistan?
Well, thank you very much. The statement is a significant one, considering that it has the EU and all its member states have been able to, members of the parliament have been able to talk with great clarity about the situation in ground, about the extrajudicial killings, about the incarceration of the 8 million people of Jammu and Kashmir, about the abductions of young people, about the molestation and rape of women that continues. So it has been done very clearly, and it has been well received in Pakistan. Our foreign ministry has also issued a statement. The foreign minister has welcomed it as well. It's critical that the international community should come to and as objective observers, impartial objective observers, talk about the terrible situation that is ongoing in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And therefore, this coming from impartial objective observer is one that is greatly appreciated and which lays the ground for further development. We may be able to get more traction in it with regards to the members of the European Union, who we hope that will be able to talk more openly. There have been certain states that have made comments on the terrible situation, and such statements by the parliament further enhance the possibility of having the world recognize the reality on ground in Jammu, the sad reality.
Ms. Janjua, you have been the part of the UN term and have played a very important role in highlighting the Kashmir issue internationally. What mechanism do you think the UN can adopt to enforce its resolutions regarding Indian-occupied Kashmir?
Well, the UN has to, obviously, these resolutions have got us an important resurrection in many ways through the UN Security Council consultative meeting that was held in August, in mid-August, after the 5th of August decision by the Indian government. And hence, it was clear from the discussions there and what the Chinese permanent representative came out and talked about as well, that everyone referred to these resolutions, and hence their legitimacy, which India kept on saying they are too old, they are outdated, they are not relevant, is a lie now. It has been belied because the Security Council itself discussed the matter, and talked about it, and was able to refer to these resolutions. The UN Security Council, the Secretary General, of course, the Human Rights Council itself, the High Commissioner on Human Rights, need to pronounce it on it as well. The High Commissioner at the start of the 42nd session of the Human Rights Council on the 9th of September made a statement in which he also expressed great concern on the situation prevailing in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, of the incarceration, of the asking for the lifting of the curfew, talking about the people in detention, and finally underscoring that there must be the people of Jammu and Kashmir, their views must be and aspirations must be taken into account before anything is done about their future. The human rights mechanisms here in Geneva and elsewhere do provide a very important network through which the Kashmiris can present their point of view and can present their grievances to the international community. These mechanisms are listened to. They are listened to in the Human Rights Council by the by international organizations, by NGOs, by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, who have extensively written on the situation, on the human rights situation in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir.
Ms. Janjua, I'll come back to you and we'll resume the discussion on this very point. I'll go to Dr. Ather Zia. So what do you think, how do you see this EU Parliament state of bringing back normalcy to IOK? What are those practical measures, according to you, that EU can take in this regard?
Well, I think not just the EU, but the entire international community, including the UN, United Nations, I think that has a great responsibility, a historical responsibility towards Kashmir. And EU from time and again has expressed its opinion. United Nations has expressed its opinion very recently. And Kashmiris are also looking towards United Nations, towards the historical resolutions that have been passed on Kashmir that stopped coming after the 1960s. After it went into a cold storage after the start of Cold War. So I think there are mechanisms already in place. What needs to be done in the region, there is demilitarization, there's deoccupation that has to happen, and self-determination is one of the tools that should be implemented, and that's what people of Kashmir are looking towards.
Okay, Dr. Ather, I'll come back to you. Ms. Janjua, Minister for External Affairs S. Jaishankar has said that India hoped to gain physical control of Azad Jammu and Kashmir one day, despite international censure. Why do you think Indian belligerent attitude remains unshaken?
Well, obviously, India is living in a world of its own. It is following its own internal policies, its electoral policies, and hence making these statements. But it must be clearly stated that the international community would see these statements as belligerent, as in many ways sort of propagating the possibility of a conflict. And that's totally unacceptable. The international community will never accept anything in which taking away a territory by force is propagated. And we are surprised and shocked that the head of the diplomacy in India has taken this route of declaring an area which is under dispute, which is a disputed area according to UN Security Council resolutions. And as has been said earlier, where the people have been granted the right to self-determination, to even talk about that, first taking away the area that was in India, under Indian occupation, and trying to merge it within India. And secondly, now making these belligerent statements is not doing any service to Indian diplomacy. In fact, it is clearly indicating that India is on a path which indicates towards a desire for conflict, and it's unacceptable.
Okay, Ms. Janjua, it is totally unacceptable, this belligerent intention of India. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan is going to address the United Nations General Assembly this month, and on the sidelines, he's expected to meet the US President Donald Trump as well. He has already offered his mediation in resolving the Kashmir dispute. So what can we expect out of this upcoming visit of the Prime Minister to the US?
Well, It's important that obviously we expect that this issue of Jammu and Kashmir will come up in the conversations between between President Trump and Prime Minister Imran Khan, and we hope that as you said, the U.S. President had clearly said that he would be ready to mediate. And if there's a possibility of doing that, I think this is the moment to do so, because otherwise it is already, the steps that have been taken by India has already brought about material change on ground, something that UN Security Council resolutions say that no material change should be brought on ground till a free and fair plebiscite under UN auspices is held. And that's an issue not only for the UN, not only for the international community, but for leaders like President Trump as well, to take cognizance of. And of course, everyone realizes that the situation points towards further difficulties and conflict in the region.
Ms. Janjua, thank you very much for time out for Indus News, and Prime Minister's Special Representative on Diplomatic Outreach, and has also served as the Foreign Secretary, joining us from Geneva. Now, I'll go to Mr. Qurban Hussain, the Member House of Lords. Sir, EU statement, how do you see this EU statement? Earlier we saw that there was a development in the UK House of Commons as well. There were concerns which were raised by the MPs over there. And most recently, EU has also censured India for its human rights violations in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And the statement goes on to say that the wishes of the Kashmiri people must be respected. So can we expect the time will come soon when the plebiscite or the right of self-determination, according to the UN Security Council resolutions, would be given to the Kashmiris?
Well, let me say, first of all, that this human rights violation situation has been worsened over the years, and many countries, including Britain, there have been voices in the houses, both houses of Parliament, in House of Commons and House of Lords, for over last few years. Now, this new wave of terror that India has imposed upon the Kashmiri people after withdrawing the 370 amendment. Now, this has brought a new dimension into it, because this time round, what India has done, not only put the whole of the state under siege, but also it has many people in Kashmir thought they were actually pro-Indians, like Farooq Abdullah, Omar Abdullah, and Mahbooba Mufti, and all that lot, who have actually been taking part in their so-called democracy as well. Even they are not spared; they are being, arrested as well. And then the curfew. They have what the reports I have, because I have friends and relatives on both sides of line of control, and I get information from locals directly. Although the communication systems have been down, the internet has been down, but nevertheless, the information we get is very, very grim situation. In the last few weeks, I've been told only the other day when I was at the Liberal Democratic Party conference, as you may know, they've also made a statement. Our foreign spokesperson on the in our party, he has issued. He made a statement in his speech the day before yesterday, condemning the human rights violations in Jammu and Kashmir. We were told that nearly 300 girls and young women have been gone missing in the last few weeks since this siege. These girls have been taken away from their homes during the siege by the army. Now, where have they got them to? What is happening to those? And those young men who have been arrested, we have been told that over 10,000 young men have been taken away during the siege, and many of them are not being returned. Some of those who have been returned, I have seen pictures where no part of their bodies is spared from torture. Now, these are very, very severe cases, and the situation has to be looked at by the United Nations Security Council. The only
Exactly,
problem is
Mr.
here
Qurban. I'll take the discussion to Dr. Ather Zia. How do you think when India has ratified the International Convention on Political and Civil Rights and it is still violating and enforcing those laws which are considered draconian and have been slammed by the United Nations as well, like Public Safety Act?
Mm-hmm. That has been going on for a long time. The Public Safety Act has been in effect since 1978, not just 1989, or as we see in the recent years. So the human rights situation in Kashmir has always been dire. There's always been direct and indirect violence from 1947 onwards, and which has grown really. It has exacerbated since 1989, and recently we see that it's increasing, and there's use of there's the rampant use of pellet guns, and there's all sorts of human rights abuses that can happen in a situation of Armed Forces Special Powers Act when the army and the government forces have no accountability. But at the same time, there is the human rights situation. At the same time, we also have to consider that Kashmiri people do have a voice and they are saying something. It's a human rights situation that we need to tell the world about. But at the same time, we also need to bring their political voices up and pay attention to what they are saying, because I think that's also a big part of that. Is a big part of their story, and which is leading to what India is doing, repressing them because of what they're saying. So I think that also needs to be kept in consideration.
Dr. Ather, I'll come back to you if you hold that thought here. Mr. Toby Cadman, international law expert from Islamabad, has joined us. Sir, when we talk about the international conventions on human rights, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, India has ratified this covenant. Despite that, how can a nation enforce those laws which are against the human rights and the values of the humanitarian law, particularly when we talk about the Public Safety Act?
Sure. I think that one of the problems that you have is when a state such as India shows a complete disregard for national and international law, and when you have a prime minister such as Modi who has shown such disregard for these principles, you are confronted with a very difficult problem of ensuring accountability, and that is a major challenge that the international community faces with a situation such as Kashmir, where we're not talking just about human rights violations. We're talking about international crimes being committed. You're talking about the unlawful annexation of a state, the subjugation of the Kashmiri people, and people being arrested en masse, which constitutes crimes against humanity. So, but it is a challenge to get legal accountability, and quite often what we have to try and ensure is diplomatic accountability through the United Nations mechanism, but it's not always so effective.
So what has the United Nations in the past done in order to censure those nations or the countries which has annexed certain territories forcefully or illegally?
Well, you've seen the examples of both Palestine and in Israel with the annexation of Crimea. You have seen these situations on the agenda of the United Nations Human Rights Council. You've seen on the agenda of the United Nations General Assembly. You have seen sanctions, diplomatic, political and trade sanctions being imposed. And you've also seen cases being brought in the International Court of Justice, for example. So one of the leading decisions of the International Court of Justice is the situation with the annexation of Jerusalem. So that's the very famous wall case is something that has been litigated in the International Court of Justice. That then is something that can be taken up in the United Nations General Assembly, which is what I would advocate is the right approach as far as Kashmir is concerned. Taken to the International Court of Justice and then taking this to the United Nations General Assembly.
So when you talk about the legal remedy, so is this option on the cards, Pakistani policymakers, that to bring this case to the International Court of Justice?
Yes, well, one of the issues that you obviously have to be aware of is that to bring the Court of Justice, it's state to state. It's not an individual petition, so the case would have to be brought by Pakistan or other interested state against India in the International Court of Justice. The UN General Assembly can push for a declaration or a declaratory opinion by the International Court of Justice, but there's greater force of law if a state such as Pakistan brings a case in justice. And as we've seen, the evidence is mounting, being documented by groups such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. So you can see that the body of evidence is increasing, and it's compelling to show that the actions of the state under the direction of Modi is very clear that international crimes and international law is being violated.
Mr. Toby Cadman, international expert, joining us from Islamabad. Thank you for being part of this show. I'll go to Dr. Ather Zia. Just a couple of moments before, just as Mr. Toby Cadman mentioned, that Amnesty International has also been raising voice against the atrocities which are being committed by India in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Earlier, the Amnesty International Secretary General has also said that Modi government has made a very big attempt to crush amnesty in India since the organization launched Let Kashmir Speak campaign. Why is India not paying heed to any sort of accusations which are being hurled by even the humanitarian organizations in the world, or even the censure it is getting from various parliaments in the world?
Well, we have to consider how India has treated the Kashmir problem for the last 40 years, ever since Shimla Agreement, and ever since the UN was sidelined essentially by India. What they have done is they have told themselves a story. They have told themselves it's a myth that has been propagated that Kashmir is right now for India a law and order situation. It's something that is not even bilateral with Pakistan, as we see happening and unraveling in the past 45 days. That it doesn't see Pakistan in any equation with it at all. And Kashmiris less so, for that matter, because every Kashmiri who matters, of all shades of opinion, they have been put behind bars. So what India has done is it believes the story. Take that in whatever way we can, but they have told themselves a story about Kashmir, and they are accepting that story, and they have made their people convinced of that story, that Kashmir is not the problem that Pakistan has been talking about, and less so the problem that Kashmiris themselves are talking about, which is the right to self-determination and talking about even independence and sovereignty of the region. So the story that they've told themselves kind of goes in line with the facade of democracy that they are portraying to the rest of the world. So it's a law and order situation for them. And then it's also the biggest democracy in South Asia that is dealing with it. So putting those two together, that's the story that's being told to the international community, that this is no problem at all. They are doing all they can to safeguard the people. And that's one of the projections that is the narrative of the Indian media, is the narrative of the Indian politicians, that the crackdown, the lockdown, and I don't know in which book such a lockdown is going to be good for the people, which is creating trauma on ground, which is creating casualties on ground. So
Dr. Ather, while celebrities are also registering their protest against Indian human rights violations in Kashmir, actors like Riz Ahmed and Jamila Jamil have pulled out of an event where Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is scheduled to receive an award by Gates Foundation. So how do you see this development?
Well, I see this part of this concerted effort that has been going on for the last 45 days after the lockdown happened, after the curfews and the human rights violation that India has done very recently. I see this as the fruit of the concerted effort that international community, media, diaspora have done so that the world community gets aware of what Modi is doing not just in Kashmir, but the rest of the India. So the evidence is mounting against this government. And we also have to know, when it comes to Kashmir, it's not just the Modi government that acts the way it does. The entire India believes the story that has been told them for the last 72 years, that Kashmir is not a problem that Kashmiris talk about, or it's not the problem.
Right, Dr. Ather Zia, very much for joining us, a writer and anthropologist joining us from Colorado, USA. Here we take a short break. After we return, we'll discuss future of Afghan peace process and the role of regional stakeholders. We'll be back in a bit. Stay with us. Welcome back to Newswire. In Afghanistan, Taliban suicide bombers killed 48 people in two separate attacks near an election rally by President Ashraf Ghani on Tuesday. The president remained unhurt. The attacks happened 11 days before Afghanistan's presidential election, which the Taliban have vowed to violently disrupt. Last week, after 9 rounds of peace talks between the US and the Taliban collapsed, Taliban then visited Moscow and Iran and briefed the respective officials on progress in peace process. Russia stressed the resumption of talks, and Russia has already hosted 2 intra-Afghan meetings this year. Pakistan has also urged the resumption of the peace talks, as it had facilitated the talks. To talk more about the growing Russian influence in Afghanistan and Pakistan's sacrifice to bring peace in Afghanistan, we are joined by Mr. Bharath Gopalaswamy from Washington, an analyst of the Distinguished Fellow Observer Researcher Foundation. And we have also been joined by Major General retired Ijaz Awan, an analyst from Islamabad. Both of you gentlemen, thank you for joining in the show. Mr. Bharath, Taliban have carried out brutal attacks just 11 days before Afghan presidential elections. They had already threatened to disrupt the elections. Do you think after such attacks, the electoral process in Afghanistan might be jeopardized?
Well, I think there is a resolve from the Afghanistan government, large sections of the Afghan civil society, and peace-loving people in Afghanistan to go ahead with the elections. 18 years, the US, the Western community, the West has actually strived for these values, and there is a strong resolve and desire to go ahead with the elections. Taliban have been bombing and attacking and killing people. So what is new now? The intensity, the frequency of the attacks will increase. I'm sure there will be serious challenges. I'm sure security will be a challenge. But I think it also drives resilience and the resolve stronger amongst the Afghan people and all those peace-loving people to go ahead with the elections. So I think I'm an optimist, and I would look at the glass more than half full. And I would say, no matter what it comes may, people have lost blood and treasure and precious lives for this. It may be delayed, but I don't think it might. There might be spotty places where the polls might not happen. But at the end of the day, I think the elections will go.
Mr. Bharath, Afghan presidential spokesperson a couple of days before had given a statement, and he said that any peace deal with the Taliban will only be considered now after the elections. Do you think that added fuel to the fire, especially when the peace talks had already collapsed?
Well, I think in practical terms, it may or may not have added fuel. I'm sure the Taliban are not very happy with the way that that the peace talks have suddenly collapsed, and the statement coming out of the U.S. president was not the one that was flattering to the Taliban. And I'm sure the Taliban will want to make a point in terms of that. That's how you see in terms of actions about what this is coming in terms of attacks and stuff. So whether it adds fuel to the fire, I'm sure it adds some fuel to the fire. But at the end of the day, this is what reality is. This is what the practical elements in front of us are, and we have to live with the practicalities.
Is there any chance that owing to the increase in intensity and the frequency of the Taliban attacks before the elections, that will goad the Afghan government to take back its already stated stance that the peace deal will be considered only after the elections, and that it can also push the US to come back to the negotiating table just before the elections?
I don't think so. I don't think that's completely out of question, because just the timing is so short right now, and between that and the elections. And I think the U.S. mindset and the mentality is now, the U.S. we've put ourselves into a spot where this is not going to be feasible for us to come to the table. There have to be big preconditions and some big events happening, and I don't see any of those things happening before anybody comes to the negotiating table again.
Moscow has urged both the parties, the US and Taliban, to resume the peace talks. How do you see the recent visit of Taliban delegation to Moscow, particularly when the talks between the US and Taliban had collapsed?
Moscow has always been trying to play a role. It has played a role, whether constructive or destructive, in the whole Afghan peace process. So yes, visiting Moscow, visiting Tehran, these are all if anybody can and play a constructive role, that is always welcome. But at the end of the day, we have to see what comes out of Moscow. What is it that they can offer? How can they guarantee peace? How are they going to sustain that peace? How are they going to finance that peace deal? So these are big, important, broad questions that one need to ask. And I'm sure Moscow is asking, and the Taliban is having those negotiations. So let's see what comes out of them.
Mr. Bharath, I'll come back to you. Major General retired Ijaz Awan, analyst from Islamabad, has joined us. Sir, on one side, Taliban didn't commit to a complete ceasefire, and on the other, they have approached Russia and Iran. Do you think Taliban have played it smartly to gain more strength on the negotiating table?
No, it's not that. I think when you negotiate from a position of parity and not from a position of strength, and one side shows the cards earlier, America committed and they wanted to extricate the troops right at the beginning, and they did not demand ceasefire. So when they entered into dialogue from a position of parity, this was very much expected. The Taliban would not like to have a ceasefire because they want to keep their force together. If they enter into ceasefire and people leave them, those who are fighting with them, it would be very difficult to get them back again. So it was understandable right in the beginning.
So do you think the recent attacks by the Taliban might put the electoral process in Afghanistan into jeopardy?
In fact, Taliban were not interested in an electoral process under this present regime because they do not consider them the true representative of the people, the Ashraf Ghani government. And they never wanted to get into electoral process under this regime. They were demanding earlier a neutral setup where they get the time to rally their voters and to go for the canvassing and all that. So they wanted that way. So I'm sure they would not like to see the electoral process going smoothly. But on the other hand, people on the other side, they want to put the Ashraf Ghani government once again in power to give them a better negotiating strength.
Okay, Mr. Ijaz, I'll come back to you. Mr. Bharath, do you think after the collapse of the talks, the Russian influence in Afghanistan has increased?
It's hard to measure whether the Russian influence in Afghanistan has increased or not. There was always a Russian influence in Afghanistan, and I think that was a very steady influence. Yes, temporarily they might have Taliban going and visiting Moscow. There might be a better, higher scale and degree. But at the end of the day, if you look at it, the government, the Ashraf Ghani government, is a government that's modeled based on the United States. So it's very hard to say whether the Russian influence has increased or not. I think there might be a greater sympathy from the Taliban towards Russia and a greater antipathy from the Taliban towards America, which always was there. So I would not frame the question this way.
So how do you see the Russian intentions? On one side, the Russians have stressed the resumption of talks, but on the other, they've already held 2 intra-Afghan meetings this year. How has this been received in the US, and how do you analyze the whole gamut of the situation?
Well, I think the general debate and the general understanding is Russia and the United States, Russia and Iran particularly, whereas the United States has been concerned, would not want the Americans to lose the war, but at the same time would not also want the Americans to win the war. So I think that has been a general understanding, that has been a broad understanding. And the Russian intervention in Afghanistan has always been seen with a degree of skepticism. And with not so of a constructive measure, but again, but I also do not know what kind of conversations that the United States and Russia have had privately vis-a-vis their objectives in Afghanistan. Today, if we all agreed on a common objective or we had a consensus on what the outcome in Afghanistan should have looked like, we shouldn't be in this situation that we are in the first place.
Mr. Bharath, do you think the two parallels for the same goal, one led by the US and other by Russia, would be counterproductive for the long-term peace in Afghanistan?
Again, I think if we're having two parallel, at some levels, I believe in intersection points. I do want these intersection points. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think we've had a common understanding with Russia and what our what the end game and the outcomes and the end goals in Afghanistan are. So I think until we have that understanding with Russia about how we want to see the outcome and the future of Afghanistan, I think these parallels are going to be counterproductive.
Okay, pretty quickly, Pakistan has had to pay a huge price for insurgency in Afghanistan. It had to bear the brunt of refugees, lost over 70,000 human lives and over $100 billion to economy, being the front row ally in the war on terror. How important do you think it was for Pakistan to see a final agreement coming to fruition between the US and the Taliban?
Like you said, Pakistan has been, the ultimate exposure after Afghanistan is Pakistan. At the end of the day, I think whatever happens in Afghanistan has a direct ramification and implication for Pakistan. I think, Pakistan needs to, at the end of the day, I think Pakistan is deeply invested in a peace deal that in whatever shape, form of the other, to end the conflict and to see a very stable and prosperous Afghanistan. So I think it is important for Pakistan. It has always been an important security challenge for Pakistan, and its investments cannot be discounted. And I think it has to, all these negotiations and conversations have a direct bearing on Pakistan, and I think that's where the importance lies.
Mr. Bharath Gopalaswamy, analyst from Washington, D.C., joining us. Thank you very much for being on the show today. That's all for now, and we'll see you soon with an in-depth analysis of the latest happenings from around the world. Till then, it's goodbye.